Don't care what this week's episode is about? Perfect.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
My name is Scott Ball, if it matters to you, and this is my co-host, AJ Matthew, if it even matters. This is episode...
for this episode, just call me whatever.
For the people who actually didn't read the title of this episode, we're joking a little bit. Today we're talking about apathy, and why your congregation might be struggling with apathy.
Yeah.
So this is a good topic, and AJ, actually, this was inspired by some data that you recently saw, correct?
Yes, the good folks over at Lifeway talked with 1,000 pastors, and apathy rose up as a very common issue that they were seeing in their churches. So, and for this list, so I mean, they could have chosen anything. I think there were 44 topics that they kind of boiled their survey down into. And so all 44, whenever they were finally asked, all right, what's your number one thing? But all 44 were chosen by somebody, but the highest number, which was only at about 10%, selected apathy. So
that, you know what, this jives with just anecdotally, but what the plural of anecdote is data, right? So in our work with churches, one of the things that we do is a values discovery exercise, and not 100% of the time, but I would guess maybe 10% of the time, apathy pops up as a potential sort of unhealthy or anti-value for churches. And so I think we see this commonly. I think it's present in more than 10% of churches, but in terms of it being like a dominant problem, at least 10% of churches, I think, would say, no, this is really dragging our church down, the apathy.
Yeah, you're probably right. It's certainly evident in a lot of churches, and even with strategic leadership teams that we work with through the strategic envisioning process, we experience apathy in those teams, at least by portions of those teams, in just people's level of engagement and energy. And desire to think outside the box, desire to collaborate. So yeah.
And the ones who don't put it as a value, maybe they just don't even care to admit to it.
Maybe they don't.
Just kidding. All right. So today we want to get to the bottom of what's driving this, and what can we do to fix it. So not just why is the congregation apathetic, but ways to not work around it, but shift the culture of your church so that that apathy is drained away. And before we hop into our list of 5 things here, I think it's worth noting that apathy, I think, is not just a problem in the local church. I think this is a culture-wide problem. I think that it starts in the culture, and it sort of seeps into our churches, this lack of caring. And it's one of the, I think, great ironies of our culture is that we have this outrage culture. People want to react really loudly to things online in particular, but then in their real lives, when you encounter people, they're just almost beat down by all of the outrage that surrounds them, that they just don't care about anything at all anymore. It's hard to kind of get the blood pressure up to care about anything. So, it's not a problem that's unique to the church, but it's certainly a problem that pervades the church.
Yeah. There's a lot of silence for all the outrage as well. There's probably a lot of people that just take in everyone else's outrage. They're like, when's it my turn to be outraged about something?
Yeah.
Never feeling like you have that same voice. So yeah, it certainly could numb you to those effects that you're experiencing all around you.
Yeah. All right. With that being said, let's hop into 5 reasons why the church, your congregation, might be a little apathetic, and what we can do to fix it. So what's our first one here, AJ?
Yeah, lack of fellowship engagement. So I think especially for our Western culture listeners, even as prevalent as quote unquote social media is, we are increasingly isolated. And so I think that a lack of engaging with other Christians within our church, I mean, just like whether that's, small groups or Sunday school classes or whatever your church might call it or whatever form it might take. But I think that a lack of an outlet, a discussion outlet for people to talk about what's going on in their lives, and maybe even talk in greater depth about your sermon application points. I mean, there's so many people that walk away from Sunday and they're like, wow, that was great. And then that's the end of it. And they're not going to remember it until next week when you give them 3 new applications for whatever the topic is. So I think increasing fellowship engagement with intentionality of being able to go deeper with one another over what your Sunday sermon might have been, I think could help break us out of this feeling of apathy. How can we really engage with what God's word is teaching us to try to affect actual life change? And I think when we try that in isolation, we fail more often than when we try it together.
Yeah, this is, I don't know how much what I'm about to say is accurate or just me spitballing, but I'm thinking back to, 1990, okay, or 1993, when the internet hadn't yet made its, surge into our collective brain, and also there's no social media. So even you can go later than that. Look at 1999 or 2000, before Facebook and all this. I think we all have this innate desire to connect, and there's no doubt that the thing that we're getting online is it's a cheaper, lesser quality version of engagement, but it still, I think, scratches that itch for a lot of people. I don't even have to have a conversation, but I can just see what's going on. I'm thinking about back in 1992 or whatever we were saying. If you wanted to know what was going on in someone's life or what trip they just went on, they'd have to go to the drugstore and print real hard photocopies of prints of their photos, and then sit down with you at a meal and let me show you all the pictures from our mission trip to Venezuela or whatever. They'd have to, there's a whole lot of things that had to go into scratching that itch for connection and knowing what's going on in people's lives. And I think that we ought not dismiss how powerful that is, that we can get a cheaper version of that scratches that itch just by scrolling Instagram and barely engaging. And so there's very little motive to do the hard work of planning a time to get together and sitting down and having a conversation, because the easy, cheap thing is even intruding in the moments when we are present with one another. So this is a real problem. I think that, again, extends beyond church, but requires extra work. I've thought a lot about this. Why is it that when I was a kid, it was easy to think of going to church 2 or 3 or 4 times? And it's because there was no cheap substitute that was even available. It just wasn't even an option. And so I think we have to be aware of that. I think we have to be aware of the fact that we're getting a cheaper version of it, and yet it's so accessible, and you're fighting against that.
Yeah, we really are. Gosh, and even think about Scott, how we talk with churches about designing levels of engagement, and how much more common it is now to talk about, hey, you only get these folks 1 day a week, maybe 2 if you're lucky. How can you maximize that? I think we know in our hearts the real teaching would be shifting the culture back away from that. How can we get people to engage more? Not just accepting the fact that, hey, they're maybe coming to church 3 times a month even. That's a strong Christian. And we've just kind of accepted that. And we're like, okay, we got to keep simplifying, keep compacting things into this tiny little space, instead of trying to have people realign their lives into what would be considered maybe more of a traditional, an old school lifestyle. But I guess we've given up on that, and
I mean,
that's unfortunate.
Sorry. Now I feel like we are evolving this podcast episode into how AJ and I would chat. I think if we were off air, but this is good. I think a good peek inside AJ and I's relationship. I don't want to give like a woe is me, all is lost type atmosphere to this. I mean, to some degree. Actually, I was just talking about this with the church I was with this past weekend. We have to accept the reality that was always true, that time spent in programs does not necessarily equate discipleship outcomes.
True.
So we have to stay laser focused on these discipleship outcomes.
Yeah.
The question is, can I get those with a limited amount of engagement? And I think to some degree, yes, if we supplement if we track and measure and care about the right things and supplement the on-campus programs by encouraging things that happen outside of the four walls. So, can I use the program that I do have to foster a 3 a.m. friendship and relationship with somebody, so that I'm having more of a dialogue and interaction with that person outside of a scheduled church program. I mean, that's what's different, is now we've got to get people away from having to force all of their friendships into the confines of what we're planning, and giving more flexibility to the real life interactions of what people are like today. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it still comes down to, if it's not programmed and scheduled and left up to people, will they prioritize it? And
fair question. Yeah.
Don't know. Some do,
right.
Some don't.
All that to say, so problem number one, why is the congregation apathetic? Because they don't have friends. I mean, everything boils down to relationship.
Yeah.
And if we aren't doing a good job of fostering relationship, then the apathy meter is only going to go higher and higher. But the more people care about the people in your church and the relationships that they have, people will like straight up not move cities or move jobs if they have deep enough relationships in a church, because it's so hard to replace that. And so you really want to have that level of kinship and friendship and fellowship. And there are things that you can do, but it is probably going to look different than it did in 1995. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. There you go. Let's move on. Our second one is barriers to serving. So, Scott and I certainly both believe that service to the church, both internal service to the church, external service in partner ministries and evangelistic opportunities, should be a core value of the church and of all believers. And a lot of churches make this really hard, too hard. And it helps point one of fellowship, because when you're serving together with people, you're building relationships with them. And so some are somewhat cumulative as we go through our list, but churches that make it too difficult, people are just wondering, what are the needs even? How do I fit in? What do I have to offer? Who would I talk to? Will I be trained in this? How much does it demand of my time? And these are all questions that people are asking, whether they're verbalizing them to you as a church leader or not, they're thinking them. And if your church isn't really good at making the needs known and the on-ramp easy, then there's probably a lot of people that are disengaged that would otherwise maybe be interested in engaging. And there's just no need to make it too complicated. And there's lots of great ways of setting up service and engagement platforms so that you can get more people doing that.
Yeah, it's so important. If you want people to not have a bunch of apathy or be apathetic in your church, they're much less likely to be apathetic if they're invested in every sense of that term. So the first really has to do with invested in relationship. And this is really taking it a step further and saying, are you invested in the mission? Are you invested in the cause? And helping people find a place that aligns with their giftedness, that aligns with how God has made them, and helping them plug into that. It's so important for people to realize that some people are called to an office, but everyone is called to ministry. And the average Christian does not either understand that or accept that reality. And it's up to us as leaders, I think, to fully engage the congregation and go, no, this is really important, not for the church's sake, but for yours. And I think that's maybe a shift for a lot of folks. They just hear, hey, the church needs volunteers. It's all about the church. They're not thinking of it through the lens of, I need to be serving because it does something for me. There's something that switches in my heart, switches in my brain when I start serving. And so people are going to be less apathetic if they are invested in the mission as well.
Yeah. Well, and then, it's barriers to serving sometimes is even the process itself. And yeah, I got to kind of throw my own church under the bus to some extent, because the process for serving,
hope they're not listening,
is really complicated and time consuming. And I get, and that's understandable, especially in like children's ministry areas. I mean, we do have to be safe. But, an application process that requires references of like even specific types of references who all actually get called, and then interview and
my understanding is this isn't just for children's ministry. Like, this is for, like, you want to be a greeter,
it's for almost every serving position in the church. I think they said parking lot doesn't have to do that. Maybe there was one other one. But basically every single serving position of the church is treated as if you're working with kids. And I'm like, I
can understand even running a background check on everybody, because that's not that onerous.
Yeah, right.
But the calling the references bit, that one's time consuming.
I mean, it takes weeks. It takes several weeks to finally be ready to serve. It's so complicated and detail oriented. I'm like, what exactly am I getting into? I thought maybe this was going to be kind of a pretty easy area to serve in. And I'm like, wow, am I signing up to be the new pastor? I'm not sure. But there's lots of churches that have done that. They've made things really complicated. And it's a barrier. So if you want more people,
I'll even say this, AJ, even the barrier of the churches that require that you have to be a member to do any kind of service. I can understand that when you're talking about teaching positions. I mean, certainly, in the leadership pipeline, we talk about different levels of leadership. Certainly when you reach certain levels of leadership, that makes complete and total sense. But some churches require it before you volunteer anywhere in the church that you be a member. And that, depending on what your membership process is like, that may take, some churches only offer membership classes a couple times a year. So, you got to go through that whole thing, and maybe there's an interview process for becoming a member, and it can be an ordeal. And and at some point people go, I'll forget it. Like, it's easier just to sit.
Yeah. Should it be harder?
You got to balance that, like checking qualifications versus actively discouraging people from serving.
Should it be harder to serve in the church than it is to go to heaven? Ask yourself. All right. Our third point is a reason for apathy in the church is monotony. But only a unique few are like, I want my life exactly the same every single day, anything. But I think for a lot of people, you got to spice things up a little bit. And so if your church has just become the place that, like, we are doing everything we can to make sure that this is so consistent and unchanging that you'll never even know which Sunday this is, then that's a breeding ground for apathy. Don't you think, Scott?
I agree with you. Like, I intrinsically agree with you, just because part of this is my personality too. Like, I like to change things up. I like to make things different. I guess I want to play devil's advocate a little bit on this
Okay.
one. There is some data, that suggests that within the Catholic Church, the only segment of the Catholic Church that has experienced growth in the last few years is with the traditional Latin Mass. And it's seen particular growth among young people. So young people, young families choosing to go, becoming Catholic, choosing to go to the traditional Latin Mass, which is actually increasingly harder to find because, I mean, long story short, the Vatican's really discouraging, which is weird because it's the one area of pocket of growth, but the Vatican's really discouraging the Latin Mass. So all those issues aside, I am curious because I tend to agree with you that if things are too much the same all the time, very predictable, stand up, sit down, why are we seeing a little bit of growth in the Catholic Church with the traditional Latin Mass? It's not even in English. Like, you don't even know what they're saying.
I was going to say, is there something behind young people are like going to church, don't have any idea what they're saying? I don't have to do anything. It doesn't affect my life since I don't even understand what they're talking about.
I don't think so. I think that there might be something about the beauty of it, like tapping into something ancient and beautiful and meaningful and intentional. I think so. Here's my pushback, maybe, or my devil's advocate, is that the problem is not the liturgy of it or the liturgical nature of it, sort of the set pre-format, whatever. I think it might be the lack of intentionality behind certain things. So I think you can have a situation where the service is pretty much set by liturgy. Yeah. But if there's I've been in a lot of churches where it seems like they just cobbled this thing together. They threw it together. The worship team figured out what they're going to do. The pastor figured out what he was going to do. And, he was writing the sermon last night. And it sounds like it when he preaches it, and they just kind of stick the thing together, duct taped it, glued it together. And it's not all that different from what you heard last week. I think that kind of monotony is lethal, but maybe there is some value in something that is like thoughtful and intentional and liturgical. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you could be. I think you can have liturgical without monotonous. And really my point on this, I was actually thinking beyond the worship service. I mean, I would get bored with the same worship service every week. That would be boring to me, not to everybody, and I recognize that. More so the monotony of if you just every now and then you look around and you're like, what are we doing here? What is this church about? It feels like nothing. Regardless of what your Sunday worship service looks like, whether it's similar week to week or not, if the church itself just has a monotonous feel to it, like it's just always here, we show up, we go home, we don't ever hear about anything really new or different or changing or exciting. That's it. It's more of this overall culture of monotony, more so than targeting the worship service itself.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I'm so even down to like, are we making any sort of impact or inroads in our community?
Right.
What are we doing to actually engage with the culture in some serious and significant way? That's a good transition probably to our next
It is. Our next point, number 4 here, is a lack of vision. And so I said in here, the vision is the antidote of monotony. And so if the church is not operating under any kind of glimpse of hope for the future, then why would we expect our people to be hopeful, on any particular Sunday when they go walk out to their car, get in and drive home? What's really going to drive the conversation? What's going to make them say, man, I'm glad to be a part of this, because it feels like we're doing something, we're going somewhere. There's something better out there than there is today. That's the kind of stuff that vision develops in the culture of the church, looking forward to a brighter tomorrow and everybody being unified in that. And so leadership of the church, it is incumbent upon the leadership of the church to develop a vision and to communicate it in a way that it's understandable, and it adds this element of energy to the church.
Yeah.
That's a sustainer right there. That's a motion driver.
Yeah, that's completely right. And I think that regardless of what you've got going on in your services, you can be a church with vision. And I think that might be maybe a misconception, is only edgy churches that look like they're from a warehouse with beams of light and fog machines. Those are the churches with vision. And, if you've got a steeple and, some puke green carpet that probably needed to be replaced a few years ago, then you can't possibly be a church with vision. And it's just not true. You can be, no matter what your church looks like, no matter what size the church is, no matter what your situation or where you're located, you can be a church that has a vision. The question is, what impact do you want to make? What impact do you want to make in your community? What impact is needed in your community? And what are you doing to change as a church in order to, and that's not necessarily, again, changing some certain thing, like changing the culture of the church to engage the culture that you're in. I think it's famously said that like politics is downstream of culture, but I think religion is culture is downstream of the church, of religion. So if you really want to make an impact on what our world looks like, it starts with the church, I believe. And we have an opportunity. I mean, you look back like in society, and you can make a direct correlation between how bad things have gotten culture-wide and the decline of the church.
Yeah.
And the less the church has stepped up in ways that matter, the more government has tried to step in to play the role that the church once played. And it's high time that the church have a vision for actually caring about the communities where they're planted.
Yeah, no doubt. That's good vision. All right, our fifth and final point is what might be driving an apathetic congregation. Apathetic leadership. Boring breeds boring. And so if the leaders of the church aren't out there feeling this sense of energy and talking about the vision, living the vision out, that's the church is going to reflect its leaders. It always does. And so, I guess my encouragement to you, Pastor, if you're listening today, and if you read this online, would be to recapture the joy and the hope and the anticipation that you had when you accepted the call to that church. I don't care if it was last year or if it was 47 years ago. At some point, you had a view of the future that was different from today, and it was exciting to you. And it's what made you say yes. It's what you felt like God was calling you to. And you've got to recapture that and build it back into your team so that your team built it into the church. I mean, as the leadership goes, so goes the church. And this is one of those. You don't have to be, Mr. Saturday energy, exciting guy 100% of the time. This guy that just pops on the scene every Sunday morning. And because most people aren't that. And if you try to put it on, you can only sustain that for so long, and people are going to see through it and know that it's not genuine. But you can build some of those people in around you, and depending on their position and how they interact with the congregation, that can be really, really helpful. So yeah, you don't need to necessarily change your personality, but you might need to watch how you come across and be intentional about just the way you are with people and whether you're an encourager. So take a little bit of time to think about that. And if you've let yourself become apathetic, and try to reverse that.
Yeah, one exercise I used to do just personally when I was serving on staff in churches was to think, would I want to go to this church? Like, if I didn't work here, would I want to go here? And that was always just a little quick diagnosis check for me. And if the answer to that was no, I'd want to think, why? What is it about this church that, if given the choice, I wouldn't want to come? Why? Is it boring? Are we not doing anything? Do I disagree with the direction of where we're going? That's just a good gut check thing that you can do. And so if you think about your own leadership and think, man, would I want to attend this church with me as pastor? And if the answer is no, that might be a good indicator that something needs to change. And before you assume that everything is someone else's fault, think about yourself and go, what do I need to change about myself?
Yeah.
And that's where it starts. So there's some research, AJ, that we share, and I don't want to misquote it. It's in our training. Maybe you'll remember more specifically, but as it relates to evangelism, that there's a direct correlation between how evangelistic a pastor is and then how evangelistic that congregation is. And I think the same can be true for apathy. Like, however apathetic the leader is, there's going to be a correlation to how apathetic the congregation is, and vice versa. If you've got real energy around what you're doing, that's going to be contagious and it's going to be obvious. And like you said, AJ, it's not necessarily about being a high energy person on the stage and, over the top and acting like a goofball. But like, if you have passion, that's going to be obvious in everything that you do, from your preaching to your facial expressions, to your body language, to, to your vision, to all these things. It's going to be obvious and it's going to be contagious.
Yeah. Go for it. Make a good positive change in yourself and drive that forward in your church. I think you'll be glad that you did.
Absolutely. Well, AJ, this has been we're on episode 123, which makes this malfersgroup.com/123 for the blog post that corresponds with this episode. It's kind of fun. 123.
Yeah, sure. Only happens once.
That's right. Yeah. So enjoy it. malfersgroup.com/123 to get today's show notes. One thing though I want to mention, AJ, before we conclude this episode, we have a couple of live events that are coming up in February. So do we want to share a few details about that?
All right. So we've got a couple of events we're going to be doing in the Tampa, Florida area on February 16th and 17th here just next month.
Yeah. So on February 16th, we're going to be at Bayside Community Church, which is in Sarasota, Florida. So if you're anywhere kind of on the Gulf Coast edge, north or even south, be a great time to head on over to Sarasota and join us for that event at Bayside Community Church on February 16th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. is the time. And then on February, if the 16th doesn't work for you, join us on the 17th. We're going to be in the Clearwater, Tampa area at Church Experience is the name of the location, which is in Dunedin, Florida. I hope I did not just botch the pronunciation. It looks like Dunedin to me, but I believe it's Dunedin, Florida. All of our Florida listeners are dying inside right now. But it's the same event on both dates, so you don't need to come to both, but just pick one. And again, it's from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we're going to focus on church revitalization, church health. It's not the podcast on the road, so to speak, but we are covering the topics that we like to talk about here in the podcast: mission and core values and strategic planning and visioning and all of these things in a condensed one-day format so that you can walk away with some practical application, a great event to attend with your staff or with a few leaders. Lunch will be included as well as the materials. It's just $30 for that whole day. So go to malfersgroup.com/events to sign up. You'll find all the information there. You'll be able to sign up and pay that $30 again. That includes your materials and lunch for that day on the 16th at Bayside Community Church in Sarasota, or on the 17th of February at Church Experience in Dunedin, Florida. And look forward to seeing you guys there. It's going to be a great time.
Yeah. And if you would be interested even in having an event in your city, then send us an email to leadership@malfirstgroup.com and talk to us about where you are and what hosting opportunities you might have, because we would love to come to your city too.
That's right. I mean, we're not taking this show on the road, but it's a little bit like taking this show on the road. So we'd love to see you in Florida and maybe host an event in your city. So reach out to us if you'd like to do that.
Great. Well, thanks for being with us. As Scott said, go to malfirstgroup.com/123 for today's show notes. Check us out over on YouTube. Like, share, subscribe, do all the things that everybody wants you to do. And we'll be back with you next week.